Hello, and welcome to the concluding lecture to the GeoCurrent series on the historical geography of natural psychoactive substances. There are two things that I want to cover today. One is a general conclusion, and the other is I want to briefly discuss two substances that I have not mentioned in previous lectures. They certainly deserve more attention. One would be Iboga and its constituent active ingredient, Ibogaine, and the other is Blue Lotus. Iboga is a powerful hallucinogen, very important in a number of societies in West Central Africa. To quote Wikipedia, the Iboga tree is central to spiritual practices among some groups in this region. The alkaloid containing root or bark are used in various ceremonies to create a near-death experience. While in lower doses, Iboga has a stimulating effect and is used to maintain alertness while hunting. In moderate or high doses, it induces dreamlike states with vivid visions and hallucinations. So it's clearly a very powerful substance. It has biphasic effects, in other words, different effects at different doses, as is common. Interestingly, Ibogaine, the main alkaloid, is receiving a lot of attention for its possible therapeutic uses, in particular as a treatment for opioid addiction. The New York Times ran this article earlier this year, and to quote from it, Ibogaine, a formidable psychedelic made from the roots of a shrub native to Central Africa, is not for the timid. It unleashes a harrowing trip that can last more than 24 hours, and the drug can cause sudden cardiac arrest and death. So it does seem to be a particularly potent drug. And like all other psychedelic substances, its effects on the user, if done in a large enough dose, can range from beatific to horrific. So I have just a couple of illustrations here from so-called trip reports on YouTube. One is titled "My Most Beautiful Experience," and the other is "Existential Depression," and with the author noting that this substance nearly drove him crazy. So it is indeed not for the timid, but it does have possible, pretty profound possible therapeutic uses. I'll spend a little more time on Blue Lotus, which is a very intriguing substance. I wish I had more time to cover both of these. Essentially, I have simply run out of time. But Blue Lotus is reputed to have been a major drug used by ancient Egyptians. It's now being widely sold and is available on internet pharmacies. It has legal status. Anyway, Wikipedia notes that it's a rare aquatic plant of freshwater pools and was grown by ancient Egyptian civilization and has significance in their religion. Yes, indeed. It has a powerful alkaloid, a porphine, which has mild sedative effects and makes it a candidate for the fruit of the lotus tree eaten by a mythical group in Homer's Odyssey. I talked before about nepenthe, something that Homer mentioned as well as a drug of forgetfulness. And on the island of the lotus eaters, eating lotus was associated also with forgetfulness. Nobody knows what this substance was, but this seems as good a candidate as any, especially considering the name. I've mentioned before Andrew Sherratt's series on sacred weeds, BBC series from the 1990s. A very interesting series where he has two volunteers take a substance like fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, or Salvia divinorum, the seer sage, or henbane, supposedly a constituent of witch's brew. And then he has three scholars discuss what they witnessed and the historical and ethnographic evidence about these drugs. So on Blue Lily or Blue Lotus, Michael Carmichael suggested the psychoactive effects of the Blue Lily and other psychoactive agents would establish a new foundation for understanding the origin of philosophy and religion in ancient Egypt. And then Alan Lloyd, an Egyptologist, took a more cautious approach. That's typical of all of these Sacred Weeds videos. One reason why I like them so much. Note that it is noted that Sherratt himself accepted a new paradigm for the origin of ancient philosophy and religion in his summation of the series. In other words, this world-famous archaeologist certainly thought that psychoactive substances were important in the genesis of early religious beliefs and beyond. Anyway, it's very clear that Blue Lotus was important in ancient Egypt, particularly among the elite. It was probably a preserve of the elite. It's a fairly rare plant. So the evidence we have of Blue Lotus consumption generally comes from wealthy Egyptians. One thing that's particularly interesting is it seems to appear in ancient Egyptian erotica. And I'll just say I think there's only one example of this, the Turin erotic papyrus, held in northern Italian city of Turin. It measures 8.5 feet by 10 inches, so it's a long scroll, 2 parts, and it contains 12 erotic vignettes depicting various sexual positions. So if we look at the actual surviving papyrus, it's in fragmentary condition, but it has been sort of reconstructed, and we see one panel there. We see grotesquely exaggerated genitalia. We see a bald, rather scrawny man and a woman. Evidently, that's typical of the entire erotic side of this papyrus. The men are depicted as somewhat old and bald and paunchy, the women much younger. But anyway, in this papyrus, which as you can see here is there's debates, is this eroticism or is it humor or is it a bit of both? It's sort of a comic sort of thing. But above the women, what do we see? We see the blue lotus flower. And so this has resulted in a lot of speculation. An article from the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine a decade ago argues that Blue Lotus was probably used with other drugs. So this is the Nymphaea cult in ancient Egypt and in the New World, a lesson in empirical pharmacology. But to quote it, depictions of the opium poppy and mandrake, a hallucinogenic plant, often appear alongside those of Blue Lotus. And King Tut's tomb contained gold-plated shrine decorated with a relief of a pharaoh holding a huge blue lotus flower and 2 mandrakes in his left hand. The same article goes on to mention that a closely related plant, another lotus species with psychoactive powers, was used in ancient Mesoamerica, or medieval Mesoamerica, classic Mesoamerica, we should say. So on a vase found in the classic period Mayan site, a headpiece of the central figure depicts a character adorned with a lotus performing a ritual dance in the Mayan ruins of Palenque. A relief in the tomb of Pakal in the Temple of Inscriptions contains representations of 2 Mayan priests standing on either side of a jaguar god. One has a lotus bud emerging from his head. The other has the same bud emerging from his headpiece. And then finally, with the same article, goes on to mention that Blue Lotus contains the powerful alkaloid. There's a porphine, which then I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but anyway, the active alkaloid here will turn into apomorphine, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which has been recommended by the FDA as a possible treatment for impotence. So I did just a little bit of looking around for evidence of this possible use. This is an article from 2020, apomorphine for the treatment of erectile dysfunction, and it says that yes, evidence indicates that it is effective, which does make me really wonder about these descriptions here, or these depictions, I should say, which seem to show older men. The man right here doesn't look particularly old, but in other parts of this papyrus, the men do look rather old and out of shape. No doubt very elite men, probably elite women, although we don't know about that, but Blue Lotus does seem to have been sort of held in reserve for the elite, and so probably no surprise that they were in need of some sort of erectile aid. Anyway, that's it for Blue Lotus, and that's it for psychoactive substances. Let me try to draw some lessons from this entire lecture series. And the main lecture would be the globalization of drugs, of psychoactive substances. In the year 1500, none of the substances examined in this lecture series were global. Now most are, and others are spreading. A related geographical lesson is that trade in psychoactive substances helped propel globalization. So it's both sides of the coin. This is often violent, often linked to imperialism. Talked about the alcohol trade connected with the slave trade or with the spread of European power in North America. Talked about the tea trade and its effect on China, and the coffee trade, tobacco trade, opium war, and so on. So over the course of these many lectures, there have been many examples of the spread of psychoactive substances through commercial networks, through large trading companies, which were often connected to imperial power. Anyway, globalized natural psychoactive substances. I would start with alcohol, which was widespread across Eurasia in 1500 and in many in South America and in Mesoamerica, but not really in North America or Australia. So it's North America north of the Rio Grande, I should say. And so during the post-1500 period, alcohol spread to the remaining areas of the world, Australia, the Pacific, what is now the U.S. and Canada, and then became global. Coffee was very locally circumscribed in 1500. It became global in the early modern period. Tea was more widely spread in 1500, but it saw the same globalization. Tobacco was limited to the Americas and spread through the world. Cannabis had spread as a drug, had spread through Central Asia, South Asia, Southwest Asia, into East Africa and Southern Africa, but then it globalized. Coca chewing, coca leaves did not, but cocaine, the main alkaloid, did. Opium itself did not, but opiates certainly did, morphine and the like. And today we have non-global but spreading psychoactive substances such as khat, long limited to Yemen, Somalia, and Ethiopia, now pretty widespread in East Africa and spreading globally as well. Kava, limited to some islands in the Pacific, mostly those of Eastern Melanesia and Western Polynesia. Now they're over most of the Pacific, and we have kava bars going into the global cities. Betel was widespread in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and some maritime areas of Asia and Africa. In some areas its use declined, but it has certainly spread into interior China and spread throughout South Asia. And then psilocybin, an interesting case, very global in its distribution, but had been very limited. While it had been widespread in Mesoamerica, ultimately restricted down pretty much to the Mazatec people of, as far as we know, of northern Oaxaca and southern Mexico, and now it's used over much of the world. Very quickly, I would note that even when illegal and culturally stigmatized, mind-altering substance use persists. Interesting example is alcohol in Iran, where the Iranian government has certainly done everything well, maybe not everything, but have certainly pushed very hard to eliminate or restrict it, particularly for the dominant Muslim population. But a recent study found that in one province, essentially a quarter of the people consume alcohol. And the highest rates are among young adults, men, elites, and city dwellers. So the Iranian clerical government has certainly not been able to get rid of alcohol. Very similar to the experiments in prohibition in the United States and many other countries. Some of the main historical lessons to be learned, some important long-term trends. One would be the decline of hallucinogens after the origin and spread of universalizing religions. This is part and parcel of the decline of shamanism. So in the ethical or universalizing religions, if you will, many of them have prohibitions or severe restrictions of alcohol use. It certainly includes Islam, almost all branches. There are some Shia offshoots like the Alevi of Turkey, Alawites in western part of Syria, who have no problem with alcohol whatsoever. But these are very much minor sects. Mainstream Islam certainly anti-alcohol. Theravada Buddhism, the form of Buddhism found in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, countries like Myanmar or Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos. Not quite as strict as Islam, but very disapproving. Certainly some Christian sects, Protestant sects essentially, and some Hindu castes. We've also saw the extinction of drugs that had been extremely important at one time. Soma, found in the Rig Veda of ancient Egypt, or Hauma in the Zoroastrian scriptures. We don't even know what these drugs were, but they were essentially, Soma had essentially a divine status in its own right. So extraordinarily important in terms of religion and in terms of social organization, and evidently in terms of warfare as well. So along with this secularization, a decline of shamanism anyway, we get secularization and de-ritualization of drug use. So most drugs that we have discussed originally had a lot of ritual surrounding them. They were consumed in a ritual and regulated context, and that essentially disappeared in most cases. Also, we see in the early modern period, and then in the modern period, emergence and spread of stimulants. So the more powerful hallucinogens are on the decline during this period, whereas stimulants are spreading and intensifying in their use. So we see both coffee and khat emerging really in the late medieval period. We see coffee, tea, and tobacco spreading rapidly in the early modern period. And then in the more modern and recent periods, we see cocaine, and artificial stimulants spreading across the world. So we may wonder if stimulants are more compatible with modern economies than other psychoactive substances. And that's really true of the mild stimulants, which would include caffeine and tobacco, betel as well. Would also include coca as a chewed substance, not cocaine. Its main active ingredient, main alkaloid. So that's another issue I probably should have highlighted on the slide, as that with increased potency and the isolation of active components, what were rather innocuous practices of stimulation through ingestion of the small quantities of a drug can become a major problem of, well, overstimulation, if you will. Despite this long-term secularization, it's important to note that religion has been very important in spreading many psychoactive substances. So we saw the link between Buddhism and tea in the early period. We saw linkages between Sufism, the mystical strain within Islam, with 3 different drugs, coffee and khat, done to keep practitioners awake during night-long chanting and prayer sessions, and then cannabis seen as an aid in and of itself to reaching the divine. I put a question mark with alcohol and Christianity, but certainly in the more traditional forms of Christianity, Eastern Orthodoxy, Oriental Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, and most early Protestant sects, not all, but most, alcohol in the form of wine, essential for the Eucharist. And so in some ways alcohol spread there, but it's questionable whether it's really alcohol as a mind-altering substance rather than alcohol as a mere ritual sip. You're not going to get any sort of psychic alteration through drinking wine in communion. But with the movement of Christian populations, say into the what is now the United States, alcohol certainly spread, although not as a religious thing. The Jesuits, though, as a religious order in South America, definitely spread yerba mate, which has a lot of caffeine. And it looks like they inadvertently, anyway, spread ayahuasca, or maybe not spread it, but as I note below, ayahuasca emerges as the focal point of syncretic faiths that take elements of indigenous South American shamanism and meld it with Roman Catholicism, the latter in most of these areas originally promulgated by the Jesuits. Another important point is from about the 1880s to the 1890s is a century of a marked global drive for drug prohibitions. Not all, no prohibition movements for caffeine um, or nicotine at this time, but certainly for stronger drugs. At the same time, I should say, part and parcel of this was the isolation of active components, increasing potency and risk. So, deriving morphine from opium or cocaine from coca was important there. Same problems emerged with a number of synthetic drugs, opioids, or synthetic stimulants. Because of these very powerful new substances, we could say, or new forms to take drugs, mass addiction emerges as a social threat, and that leads to anti-drug mass campaigns. But I do note some of these campaigns got out of hand and involved some outrageous lies discrediting genuine concerns. In particular, what I'm talking about here is the anti-cannabis campaign, which reached its height in the 1930s in the United States, where cannabis was depicted by many as the most dangerous drug, a drug that would lead to addiction, violence, suicide, insanity, and death, with no credible research behind that. I talked quite a bit in the lecture on the last lecture on one of the lectures anyway on cannabis of how and why this happened, so I won't go into it in any greater detail now. Prohibition these days is on the decline for some drugs, such as cannabis, which is now becoming legal over much of the United States, and is probably heading in that direction, and is also becoming legal, at least for so-called medical uses through much of the rest of the world. But at the same time, there's a new move to prohibit tobacco. We have a USA Today article claiming that a majority of Americans support blocking sales of all tobacco products, or an AP article on a California bill that would eventually ban all tobacco sales. So if tobacco does end up being prohibited, outlawed, I wonder how much illegal tobacco growing is going to start up. There's already a big market in smuggled low-tax cigarettes, and I would assume that if tobacco is outlawed, a larger black market would develop. Another point I want to make is question really is whether there's a postmodern resurgence of psychedelics. I put postmodern in quotation marks because I don't really like the term. It means many different things to many people. What I mean by postmodern is simply after the modern regime. The modern regime, as I've been at pains to explain, was one marked by the reduction and in many cases extinction of the use of hallucinogens, and psychedelics being a subcategory of hallucinogens. But today we're seeing a resurgence of psychedelics, not of all hallucinogens. I certainly don't see much evidence of a resurgence of deliriance of drugs like henbane, although they have their fans. But psychedelics are often touted today as something that's effective to be used for mental health purposes or self-realization or spiritual purposes. This leads to concern. There's a lot of enthusiasm in some quarters, and there's a lot of worry in other quarters. So if you go into the conservative media, you'll often find concerns about a pagan revival associated with this. I have a slide shows an article from the European Conservative on the emergence of a new paganism. But to quote the article here, the pagan society belongs to the great Pan, god of sex and violence. In this respect, our societies are becoming pagan again, with paganism sacred or even adored. Paganism, I should say. No mention of drugs there, but along with sex and violence, drugs could certainly be mentioned. Could there be any sort of neo-pagan revival? There are people who claim to be neo-pagans. There are neo-pagan religious institutions that have been established, the formal neo-paganism, if you will. But these are relatively small numbers. Pew Research Center says about 1 to 1.5 million U.S. citizens identify as neo-pagans. but that doesn't mean that their neo-paganism is associated with drugs. I mean, there certainly is a lot of association with it. A lot of the groups that neo-pagans hearken back to, Druids, so-called witches of medieval Europe, even the classical world with its Eleusinian mysteries, which seem to have involved the ingestion of ergot, a very powerful mind-altering substance. So there's a lot of ritual drug use associated with virtually any kind of pagan religion, but paganism is such a broad term. It means so many different things that I'm skeptical to go very far here. I would note, though, that in doing some research on this topic, I found that some self-proclaimed pagans are very much opposed to ritual drug use. Here's an article here saying, no reputed coven of witches would endorse the use of drugs in rituals or ceremonies, with the notable exception of Native Americans using peyote. Well, Native Americans using peyotes are not involved in covens. The Native American church actually has a lot of aspects of Christianity within it. Anyway, make of that what you will. I'll also bring up a few unanswerable questions. How should we interpret the fact that psychoactive drug use is almost universal in human societies? There are very few historically. The Inuit or so-called Eskimo of the far north of North America, no real evidence that they ever used psychoactive substances. There are some other groups as well, but it's uncommon. So is this a human universal? Does it speak to some deep need of the human psyche to escape normality and have an alternative experience of consciousness? Well, maybe. But actually, this to me begs a question of just how useful is the concept of psychoactive drug. I mean, I obviously find it useful enough to have devoted a whole lecture series to it, but I'd also note that the difference between drinking a cup of tea with a small amount of caffeine is of an entirely different order of reality, if you will, than drinking a cup of ayahuasca containing DMT and other harmala alkaloids, a whole brew of psychoactive substances that results in, first a lot of physical distress and then transportation to absolute alternative reality for a pretty prolonged period of time. When I think about the problems that psychoactive drug use cause, but also the potential that they have to address some human needs, I end up sort of wondering if it would ever be possible to return to a more ritualized, or we might say socially regulated regime of psychoactive drug use. Historically, drug use was generally regulated through religious institutions and social norms as well. And by secularizing and escaping that, that opened up possibility for much greater levels of abuse. Of course, it depends a lot on what drug we're talking about. And I do wonder whether a drug-free society, though, is a possibility or even a worthwhile goal. One of the reasons goes back to the Slingerland alcohol thesis that I've talked about at some length. Slingerland argues in the book Drunk that alcohol has a very important psychological and social role, which is why it continues to be consumed, and most societies have consumed it, regardless of the very real damage and harm that it causes. And so Slingerland argues that it's important to take the prefrontal cortex offline to a certain degree to allow for more creativity, and also to disinhibit people to allow them to socially bond more easily. So 2 quotes from him. Given that our prefrontal cortex is the key to our success as a species, consuming any amount of alcohol or other intoxicants seems really stupid. Well, seems. But then he goes on to say, our desire for alcohol is not an evolutionary mistake. There are good reasons why we get drunk. I spent a lot of time thinking about Slingerland's book. I've read it through twice, and I think there's something important that he's saying. But then again, that begs another question: is that true for other drugs? And he mentions this issue, doesn't go into it. On the slide here, just for humor, I have Dorothy Parker, famous wit, with her line that I'm not a writer with a drinking problem. I'm a drinker with a writing problem. And then there's an entire podcast called Drinkers with Writing Problems, because lo and behold, a number of quite a few great writers have had a drinking problem. Many of them have credited alcohol with creativity. Then we can ask the same question about cannabis. I did at some length in one of my lectures on cannabis, so I won't go into it. And a somewhat similar issue is whether psychedelics can offer a legitimate path to a spiritual experience, or is it just an artificial simulacra, a false paradise, if you will, or a cheap way to try to find spirituality that doesn't really give you the real thing. Now, there are plenty of people who think that psychedelics are a very powerful and legitimate path to communion with the divine or spirituality or whatever you want to call it. So I have some of those illustrations here, but it's a genuine topic for debate, and I'm not going to come down hard on one side or the other. Just a few more slides here. I do want to note or I do want to ask a question, are drugs or some drugs suitable for some people and not for others? So there has been a lot of psychological work on the so-called addictive personality. And the illustration on the right, I put a question mark because it has both thrill seekers and anxious people as liable to addiction. And those are pretty much opposite traits. Thrill seekers tend not to be anxious people, and anxious people tend not to be thrill seekers. But both of those traits, being very anxious or being overly devoted to thrill seeking, are certain orientations, both of which may be associated with addiction, perhaps addiction to different substances, though. Anxious people would be more inclined to become addicted to pharmaceutical products that reduce anxiety, but that, or alcohol as well. Thrill seekers may be inclined to alcohol, but even more inclined to drugs like cocaine or meth or something like that are sort of thrill giving. So it depends a lot on the drug we're talking about. But traits of addictive personalities that are found in many studies are impulsive behavior, thrill-seeking again, risk-taking, antisocial, lacking self-regulation, apathetic, obsessive, compulsive, a lot of very different sort of traits. But it is very important to note that some people are very likely to become addicted and other people are not. There are some people who will try heroin and say, "Oh man, I like that so much, they'll do it again, and before you know it, they're addicted." There are other people who become addicted while receiving, say, morphine in a hospital, and then really have no problem giving it up. They just start cutting it back, and before long it's gone. Most people are actually in that category. They become addicted to a substance like morphine, and they will quit. There are other people who will sort of readily enter addiction even without a medical issue. So it varies so much by individual personality and experience. And that leads to the question of how much does this sort of propensity for drug use or abuse or overuse, does it correlate with personality traits? And here I just want to very briefly bring up the big 5 personality traits. These are pretty well established, being conscientiousness, agreeableness. This diagram here has emotional stability. That's framing it positively. It's more often framed negatively as neuroticism, but you could take either emphasis. But note, of course, they're opposite. Openness to experience or extroversion. So they have a lot of subcomponents, but this seems to be very consistent. It seems to be consistent cross-culturally. And of course, most people are not in people are not in one category or the other. Rather, they have different levels of all of these things. So we have different as individuals, different levels of conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, openness, and emotional stability as it's framed here. So how does this relate to drug use or abuse or addiction? I did a little research on this, looking for research articles on it. I found, the most interesting article I found was from 2023 on the Big Five personality traits in illicit drug use. So they weren't looking at alcohol or tobacco or legal drugs, but illegal ones are widely illegal. And they found some interesting correlations. They found that people with high levels of neuroticism or low emotional stability are liable to prescription drug abuse. No surprise, a lot of those people are taking prescription drugs to try to control their psychological problems and often end up abusing them. Highly extroverted people, very outgoing people, have that personality type has a correlation with cocaine or crack cocaine and stimulant. No, I could think we could more precisely say amphetamine, methamphetamine use. As does low agreeableness, people who do not get along well with others. They have a high level of abuse of cocaine and of opioids, and opiates too. It just has opioids here. People who have high openness to experience, people who are sort of adventuresome and looking for new things, not as a thrill, but just out of interest more, have a propensity to use cannabis. And with conscientiousness, there was no correlations found. So very intriguing. I'd like to see more research on this topic. And finally, just to conclude this lecture series, I just want to say that if a person wants to take a psychoactive substance, particularly a powerful psychoactive substance, I think it is best to follow the Delphic maxims. And the two most important, and I should say these were inscribed on the Temple of Delphi, Temple to Apollo, in central Greece, which was probably the most important individual shrine in Greece where people would go for prophecies. The Pythia, the woman who gave the prophecy, may have been under psychoactive influence herself, ethylene gas perhaps, or maybe some other substance. But anyway, when you entered the Temple of Delphi, there were three of these maxims. These are the most famous two: are know thyself and nothing in excess. So I put in know thyself because you should know what your personality profile is. If you're an extremely anxious person, I would not advise using cannabis. If you are someone who has a high propensity towards addiction, watch out for addictive substances, from nicotine to cocaine to any opioids. Be very, very careful. And then nothing in excess. I think this is just a general good guideline to human behavior. And certainly one of the big problems with all sorts of drugs is excess, use to excess. So if one wants to have a successful life, I think it is very wise to follow the Delphic maxim of nothing in excess. But of course, that begs the question of what is excess? And that may vary from one person to the other. So thank you for tuning into these lectures. If you have, there will be a new GeoCurrents lecture series. I hope to start posting this fall. This is on the historical geography of presidential elections in the United States. So quite a different topic. I'm interested in the historical geography of just about anything there is, and whether it's psychoactive substances or elections or, like I say, just about anything else. So I hope to do more of these series in the future, and I hope interested people will be able to watch and listen to them. Thank you.